How do I help my PDA child or teen have a healthy self-concept and an affirming identity? This is a question that I get a lot from parents. It also comes in the form of other questions and concerns, like a PDA child who might say, "I'm the worst," or "I'm such a bad kid. I don't get anything right. I hate myself." Or it can even move into the space of self-harm, destroying one's own things, etc. So today I want to talk about some places that parents get stuck when supporting a healthy self-concept and PDA or other neurotype or not neurotype identity, and give you some three or four practical steps that you can start using in order to support this process in your child or teen. But before I do, I want to just remind everyone that we have 3 days left to enroll in our signature live program, which is the Paradigm Shift program. And this is our only live offering that gives you direct mentorship and coaching, spot coaching from me and the other coaches. It also includes support for your nervous system, as well as an online moderated community for 3 months. And then you graduate into an alumni community for 7 months. Okay, so that is open now. But now let's return to healthy self-concept and identity. Okay, so I want to start with a story from my son, and then we'll broaden out to include bigger picture concepts and how we might apply these to your specific child and family. Okay, so when my son was young, I thought he seemed extraordinarily confident, okay? So he was not a crier, he was not someone who expressed emotion, and he was labeled before he went into burnout, by his preschool teachers as like really confident or a leader. But this showed up as him like looking me in the eye and me telling him not to do something and him fixating on doing the thing, okay? So I thought he was like almost arrogant or overly confident, which seems silly saying it now, looking back on the fact that he was only 5. But he was so confusing to me, okay? But as he started to get a little bit older and more accommodated, he could express a little bit more. And I remember one time us driving home from occupational therapy, and I would be not speaking, waiting for him to speak and trying not to trigger him. And I remember him asking me, "Mama, did God make me this way on purpose?" And it like broke my heart, because it was such a reflection of him processing the fact that he would perceive threat and his body would go into fight flight, and he would do things that he didn't actually want to be doing, or things that were not aligned with his actual heart and intention and rational brain. Okay, so I remember hearing that from the back seat and just being like, oh, it like got my mama heart. And of course I said, you are this way for a reason. God doesn't make mistakes. I tried to say all the right things, but, he sort of didn't continue the conversation. But flash forward, after intensely accommodating him for, a consistent period of years, he now has a very healthy self-concept and awareness of how his nervous system works, and can say things like, "I do this way because I'm PDA." For example, in his classroom, the teacher asked him, "Why do you keep starting in the middle of the worksheet instead of starting at the top where, it flows logically?" And he's like, "Well, my brain needs to start in the middle of the worksheet or else it's hard for me to do it," right? So he's equalizing against the expectation that he has to start at step 1, which is an external expectation, or the worksheet is actually like above him and he's perceiving threat. And so he's adaptively starting at the middle of the worksheet and getting a sense of nervous system safety. Okay, so it's a small example, but what's compelling is that he actually said to his teacher, "I do this because I'm PDA and it helps me," right? And the teacher was like, great. And then another kid was like, well, can I start in the middle of the worksheet? And the teacher was like, sure. Okay, so of course we're intersecting with an affirming environment, but how do we go from a child who is asking like why they were made this certain way and not understanding themselves or their behavior to a child or teen who has an awareness of how their nervous system works, feels confident about who they are, and can use that awareness to manage themselves and advocate. And this is not like a quick fix or something that like our 20 to 30 minutes together is going to resolve, but I'm going to give you some places that parents get stuck and then tips for how we work through one element of this as a place to get started. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the three places that parents get stuck with identity and diagnosis and naming the threat response, and then we're going to talk about the practical steps. Okay, so the first place that I see parents coming into the paradigm shift program or coaching containers getting stuck with this topic is that they are first conflating diagnosis, nervous system, and identity. Okay, so the first thing we want to do as parents is to decouple or separate these three things. Okay, why do we need to do that? First of all, if you think about it, a diagnosis is a medical diagnosis, right? And often our children or are given these diagnoses, or we either give them or a doctor gives them to them without their autonomy around it, right? So all of a sudden we're telling a PDA child or teen whose entire nervous system is wired to perceive threat around not having a choice or autonomy or the perception of equality. And so you have a doctor who's like, you're this, right? You're ADHD, you're autistic, or the parent who just bestows it upon them, right? And so for our PDA children and teens, this is logically going to be something that really activates their nervous system. Remember the root cause of what causes the physiology of the nervous system to go off, that causes the brain to think I'm in danger or I'm going to die, is not having freedom, autonomy, and choice, and feeling like someone or something is above us, okay? So diagnosis often comes with avoidance, rejection, and activation, okay? So if you're listening to this as a podcast, I'd love for you to reflect, like, A, has my child gotten a diagnosis? B, how did they respond to that information? And C, would it be helpful if I actually separated this process of supporting healthy self-concept and identity from the diagnosis entirely, right? So when we're in a program together, right, the Paradigm Shift program, for example, we have 3 months live together. And so what I tell parents is, you know, especially if your question is, when do I tell my kid, or when do I tell my teen, how do I communicate the diagnosis? I encourage the parent to just say, hey, we've got 3 months together. Let's just pick a shelf or a box, and we're going to take that question or that diagnosis, and we're going to put it on a shelf. Because what actually matters is what makes your child or teen feel that they are good inside, that they have an accurate description of their lived experience and can connect to a sense of belonging and community. Okay, so we separate out the diagnosis. And if you're here with me live, I would love for you to just drop an emoji or a comment if your PDA child or teen has rejected their diagnosis. If they don't want to talk about it, they say stop talking, they say not, that's not me, or they just refuse to engage on it, because that's a very, very common pattern. Okay, so if that's you, I see you. So we put the diagnosis on a shelf, and now we have two other concepts or pathways which we're also going to separate. Okay, so we have naming the nervous system and the reaction that their bodies have in response to the neuroception, which just means subconscious perception of threat that they might not even be aware of. We're going to separate the response of their nervous system and the identity formation, okay? We're going to look at these as two separate processes, okay? Why? Because the naming of the nervous system activation is going to be something that we're going to allow negativity around. Okay, so parents often get worried about, like, my kid's naming their threat response, fire or venom or something negative, this part of them that they don't like. Okay, and we want to allow and embrace that because all of us have a nervous system that reacts in ways that's not necessarily, quote, rational or easy to be around when we're perceiving threat, right? All of us have that. Theirs are more active and in response to things that not all brains respond to, the perception of losses of autonomy and equality with a nervous system response. But we're going to normalize and connect that these activations of fight, flight, or freeze, shut down, or fawn are actually things that all of our bodies do in response to threat, right? So we would never tell someone, an adult or a child or a teen, like if they were in a car crash and they were stuck with like a seatbelt and they were trying to get out and they were like super violent, adrenaline going, screaming the F word, we would never judge their character or who they are because of that response. The fact with our children is that we can't see that car crash or the perception of that or the fact that they're perceiving that life threat. Okay, so we want to allow this to be connected to the human experience. We want to allow it to be something that they might feel negatively about and frustrated by because it takes over their body. I mean, I certainly have this experience when I have functional freeze episodes or when my nervous system makes it hard for me to engage or be creative or even reach out to other people. Okay, and then third, so we put the diagnosis on the shelf. Then we have a process of naming the threat response, which is not something I'll go into today because that's a whole module in the paradigm shift program that we walk parents through. But I want to just introduce you a little bit about the process of identity formation, okay? So we've separated out these three concepts, and then I want to emphasize that the third concept of identity is not the same as a diagnosis, a medical diagnosis. It's also not the same as having a name for a nervous system response. And identity is something that we choose, okay? And it is an intersection, this is my perspective, an intersection of both our lived experience and where it intersects with a sense of belonging and community. Okay, and so this can be lots of different things. In the neurodiversity space, we see a lot of identity first players in the space, cool creators, people who are helping us learn more about neurodivergence. And they might be, I'm autistic, I'm ADHD, I'm PDA, right? But there's another side to this, which is that some people who have an internal lived experience of neurodivergence don't necessarily choose a neurotype as their primary identity or any identity at all. Okay, so we have to allow that, or we don't ever have to do anything, because in my space there's no shoulds, have to's, anything. You have full autonomy and agency as the beautiful, intelligent people and parents that you are. But the invitation is to allow there to be as much autonomy in the process of your child or teen's identity formation as there is in other areas where you are helping them be accommodated, okay? And why is this important? Because some of these children and teens that we're working with they're gonna grasp this identity of PDA and be like, yes, I have a sense of community, I have a sense of belonging, this makes sense, I'm PDA autistic, okay? And that's my son. He's very, at this stage in his life, as a 10-year-old, he is like, I'm a PDAer, okay? And I love that for him. Then we have other children and our parents of children in our programs that we've worked with, and they have children who they walk through the process I'm going to talk to you about, and they choose something else, right? They don't necessarily choose PDA. They choose ADHD, or they choose autistic, or there's a third category, which is not choosing any neurotype at all as an identity. And there is a subset of children and teens who just want to be John, or they just want to be Susie. They don't want to identify with a neurotype. And so we want to give them that autonomy and space. Okay, so I see like there's like a trolley going on, which is fine. Block. Hold on. All right, just blocked. Yeah, just let me know if I need to block people. It's one of the things I do. Okay, back to it. Okay, so the second place that parents get stuck is that they are afraid of labels altogether. Maybe because they've had a negative experience when talking about the diagnosis with their PDA child or teen. And so we want to acknowledge that fear, but also remember that naming the threat response is simply something that all of us benefit from learning, which is just like, what is the name that we're going to give to our nervous system when it perceives threat and has a physiological reaction, right? And what I teach parents to do is do this process within a family system. So it might be the dad, the mom, the sibling all working on this together, and then the PDA are gravitating towards this conversation without being like, hey, we're going to talk about the nervous system, or here's this book, let's engage on it, because as we all know, that is just going to be a rejection or an avoidance, okay? The second thing to remember, which I just talked about, is that identity is an autonomous process that allows our children to feel a sense of belonging and that they're not alone in this experience. Okay? The third place that I already mentioned that parents get stuck is really twofold. And I see this over and over again in the program that we teach live, which is they want to go really fast and really hard to solve the problem as fast as possible and sort of to end up bestowing an identity on them or telling them that you're this or this is your diagnosis, okay? So if that's been you, no worries. Like, we can always start again and take a different approach. So feel free to drop an emoji or a comment if that has been you, where you were so excited to learn about PDA and something that made sense for your PDA child or teen that you sort of introduced it or pushed it in a way that made their brain perceive threat because we had an agenda or an expectation around it, okay? So those are the three places that I see parents get stuck or not make the progress that they want to make on this topic. And so here are a few practical steps that, combined with acute observation of how your child or teen is responding to each of these steps, could be very helpful. And so this is going to be more oriented towards the identity formation, okay? So first I want you to think about like clean slate. I've put the diagnoses that they've received or not received on a shelf. I don't need to worry about those. The naming of the threat response is going to be its own process, but right now I'm going to be facilitating the possibility of a healthy identity. Okay? Yeah, so Pineapples and Pixie says, actually, it's the opposite. I haven't introduced him to PDA at all. Totally fine. Okay, this is going to give you some steps to experiment with. Okay, so the first step is to start using declarative language. Declarative language is just not direct questions or imperatives, meaning like, what do you think your identity is? Or, I think you're an ADHD, or I think, like imperatives, and really just observations of your child that are affirming and connected to the way that their brain works. Okay? So examples from my own son when he was little would be when he was really freaking out and pointing to like a hawk or a bird a mile away that my eyes couldn't see. He had that visual acuity, but he would get really upset because I wouldn't be able to see the thing. And so I started saying an affirmation to him of like, wow, you have such sharp eyes. And then I observed, I could see in his face that that would be regulating to him, that he wasn't having that physical activation in response to my words, okay? Wow, your eyes are so sharp. And so I started using declarative sentences to do affirmations whenever I saw things that were unique to what I thought his brain wiring was, and turning it more into a positive, right? So one of the things that he would say or do, he would get really agitated if I wasn't doing things fast enough or bringing his food, or if he was bored, or needed my attention. Mama, 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 right? And I would say, I can't believe how much faster your brain works than mine, right? And so I'm turning this like frustrating experience into like, wow, his brain is actually moving a lot faster than mine and needing more dopamine than mine. And so I'm naming it in an affirming way. Okay. So what I want you to do now is just take a moment to either write down or brainstorm or drop into the chat. What's one affirming declarative sentence that you could say to your child or teen this week, right? So types of sentences that parents have experimented with could be like, I've never met anyone like you who can memorize all the Minecraft characters this well. Or, you have such a natural connection to animals. Or, they're taking apart something that you bought for them over the Christmas holidays and using it in a totally different way. And you're frustrated because you're like, that's a really expensive gift. Like, what are they doing? But you're like, I have never seen such a creative brain that's able to take things apart and come up with new ideas. Okay? So your task, if you want, your invitation is to start thinking about these affirmation sentences. Okay? And then, and observe, right? Like if your child is super in burnout or your teen is really in burnout and you haven't sort of reestablished that connection, this might be too activating, okay? And that just means we take a little bit more time, right? So I'm seeing some people's ideas, which is awesome. Recognizing strengths. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ashley. Cato Deritz. This worked for my 40-year-old ex-husband who's on the spectrum. Love it. Bree says, we often say, I never thought of that. You're so creative. Love it. I've never seen someone focus so hard on basketball. Yeah. Special interest focus and hyper focus is awesome. Great examples. Very useful. Awesome. Okay. So we're in that affirmation stage. Okay. And that could last a month. It could last 6 months. It could just last a week. It just depends on how you observe your child reacting, but also, if you are perceiving, like, are they ready for the next step, which is going to bring in a little bit less totally positive and some more challenges that we're linking. Okay. Yeah. I see Kristen said, I often use your memory is so much better than mine because mine will remember what I said later and didn't do something like I said I would. Yeah. I love that example of turning something frustrating and annoying as a parent and like recognizing the strength underlying that. Beautiful. So then we have connecting this affirmation, because remember what we talked about. Identity is the intersection of the unique lived experience, so like how their brain works and their nervous system works, with a sense of belonging, the intersection with others, feeling connected to a community, that there are other people out there, that there's nothing wrong with you that makes you, the only person that experiences this. So then we can start floating some sentences, maybe a month later or longer. I'm learning about other kids who, sentence, affirmation, who have sharp eyes like you and really need a lot of screen time, or and have a harder time with rules, or if your child or teen is in burnout and are having trouble accessing school. Okay? So we're starting to connect the affirmation to maybe some more challenges and a sense of belonging. Okay? And we're observing, how are they responding to this? They might react and say, well, like, who are these kids? Or tell me more about that. Or they might just not say anything, which means we want to pause and wait a little bit longer. Or they might reject and say, stop talking, which just means maybe pause for 2 months and return to it. Okay? The third step in this process would be linking the affirmation sentences and belonging to an offering of a label or a category or a word like PDA. So it might be the third conversation, or it might be one of many. That is, you know how we've been talking about kids who have sharp eyes and who have a harder time with rules. Maybe they say, Mom, stop talking, and we drop it. And we wait another week and try again, or we wait 2 weeks. But maybe they're like, yeah. And then you can say, I just learned a new word for it. There's actually a word for these kids and teens and grown-ups, right? And they might say, I don't want to talk about it, in which case we drop it, giving them the accommodation of autonomy and equality. Or they might say, well, what is it? I learned that the word is PDA, which stands for pathological demand avoidance, or some people like the term pervasive drive for autonomy, period, right? And you just see what they say. And most likely, many of these children and teens will not say anything at all, and so we drop it, or they'll say, I don't want to talk about it, but then we allow that seed to sprout on their timeline. And this is where the magic happens. Allowing this process to be organic and reflective of their pace without our timeline agenda. Okay, so I've seen this process work, not just for my family, but for hundreds of families with PDA children and teens. So I hope that this way of reframing the way that we approach this and allowing even more autonomy into the process of identity formation and healthy self-concept will allow you to break through some of that like stagnancy or resistance that many of you who I've worked with have expressed as a sticking point. Okay, so if you're interested in my help applying this to your specific context, your family, your child, the place that I would do that is in the Paradigm Shift program. So we have an entire module on affirmation, which is all about these concepts and supporting you with scripts, sticking points, timelines to apply to your specific family. So we would do that in our live spot coaching calls on Wednesdays, or in the moderated community where we actually do some spot coaching in that online community. So if you are interested in that, the Paradigm Shift program is open for enrollment until spots fill for this cohort, or until Friday, which is 3 days away. All right, my friends, I hope that was helpful, and I will see you again soon.